when I asked Liam, to give me some of his bio, aside from the fact that I already have known Liam for 6 years,
Probably.
it feels like forever.
In a good way.
Yes, absolutely. In a very good way. He suggested I go to his website, which is liammichaelhooper.com. You can learn more about him later to pull from his bio there. So I'm just going to read a few key points. Liam M. Hooper, MDiv, is the founder of GRASS, Gender Revisioning and Sexuality Pathways, which aims to improve the lives of trans people in the community through public education, advocacy, activism, and general support activities. As an openly trans man, Lee takes seriously the call to freely tell his story, to be as authentically who he is as possible, to engage in responsible education and advocacy, and to hear and respect the stories of others. As a previous mental health counselor, program developer, and professional trainer, Lee is keenly attentive to and concerned about the bio-psycho-social experiential dimensions affecting individual persons, trans individuals primarily, as well as all of us. And so with all of that, there's more, but the biggest part is he's a spirit brother for me. And so I'm really proud to introduce to you Liam Hooper.
Thank you, Blair. So aren't you all beautiful? Sorry we're a few minutes late. I began doing some contract work with Believe Out Loud. Does anybody know who Believe Out Loud is? Well, they're a national, largely social media and internet-based group that has this marvelous goal of creating a world where any LGBT person anywhere in the United States can walk into any Christian church and be welcomed and affirmed. That's obviously a lot to aim for, but if you don't aim big, you don't get anywhere, right? So we are shipping out a bunch of stuff today that I was responsible for, and I made mistakes, so I had to clean it up. And that's the kind of guy I am. But I still got here in time to be with you. I'm very grateful that you all are here. It's a bit daunting to have so many of my peers with us this evening, but I think we'll be okay. If it's all right with you, we'll take a moment of just sort of quasi-spiritual anarchy and poetic contemplation for a second. There's just some thoughts I want to share with you, and then I'll briefly give you, if you feel like you need them. I'm thinking, usually most people think they don't, and then they find out that they do. We'll clarify some terms, and then speak for a moment about what I think is the core reason we're here, which is to have maybe a deeper understanding of what transgender persons or trans-spirited people might need from their faith communities. So how does all that sound to you? Okay. So to talk about transgender beingness and persons is really to talk, first of all, of bodies and identity as neither separate from the other, right? These things are deeply connected. It is also to speak of trans-spiritedness, because we are, as Maxwell Falero says, intuition and will concretized in the flesh. These things, intuition, will, and flesh, are attributes of our spiritual nature. Before we can delve into the body as spirited beingness, we need to clarify some terms, though. So I'm going to do that for you right now. So when we talk about identity, I'm talking about that both from a spiritual perspective of a minister, but also a person who spent 30 years in the mental health field. So I have sort of this broad way of thinking about identity. Identity then being the subjective self that emerges out of experiences, perceptions, beliefs, predispositions, all of which occur in the interconnected, interaffecting, temporal context of self and world, which is to say that everything we encounter and that encounters us in our bodies and outside of our bodies shapes and forms us, and we shape and form that. And that subjective sense of self is that which we call identity, right? Versus personality, which are those more objective patterns of thinking and being and behaving in the world that people see. You can't necessarily see an identity, right? You might see aspects or attributes of a person's sense of self, but you don't see the self. Unless, of course, the self transforms. And then you might see some aspects of that. So when we talk about transgender or beingness, you'll notice, first of all, I don't ever use the following terms. I never use trans experience, and I don't say that we identify as trans. And the reason for that is because I'm not having a transgender experience, I am a transgender person. I'm having the experience of being a human being in the world with other human beings doing the same thing. I don't identify as trans. It is part and parcel of who I am. It is not all of who I am, but it certainly informs who I am and is a large portion of that part of myself that has had to navigate some things in an interesting way in a world that codifies things in terms of binary absolutes, right? So when we talk about trans beingness, what we're really talking about is the distinction that our culture has constructed over centuries, and they vary from culture to culture, around sex, chromosomal structure, reproductive organs, gender, and how all of that stuff manifests in a person, or in the context of personhood, right? So when we use the term sex, we're talking about forms, the various forms, we're led to believe there are only two, really, but there are more than that. Forms of chromosomal, reproductive, and genital organs and structures that present with an individual as that individual comes into the world, right? And we have this idea that XX chromosomes will always equal things like a vagina, a cervix, ovaries, uterus, clitoris, and labia, and then we decide that that is female. We've also come to be taught that an XY chromosomal configuration results in a penis, testes, scrotum, prostate, etc., and that we refer to that as male. That's not true. There are approximately, well, depending on whose numbers you use, and I usually refer to Anne Fausto Sterling's research on intersex presentation. But since the dawn of time, human beings have been born with different chromosomal and reproductive organ structures. I believe, and there's a mounting body of research to suggest that trans people are part of that just continuum of what it is to be a person. Whether we're talking about brain formation and psychological self-understanding, or chromosomes, or reproductive organs, that all of that is part of a continuum of what it means to be a human being. And many and myriad manifestations of that can occur, and all of those occur in nature. About one, depending on whose numbers you use, it's 1 in every 1,500 live births. But if you go across the broad spectrum of how we define what the medical presentation of intersex is, it's up as many as 1 in every 500 live births are intersex, which means they have a chromosomal and or reproductive sex organ presentation that doesn't neatly position them in these ideas we have of male and female. And as I said, there's a mounting body of evidence to suggest in regard to brain formation, like when the body produces reproductive organs and genitalia in a fetus, and when the parts of the brain that understand gender develop are not at the same time. They occur independent of one another. And there's mounting evidence that our sense of self as a gendered being in our brain is influenced by many things. So we can say that trans people are part of a natural continuum of what it is to be human. So when we talk about gender, then we're talking about how we think about what it means to have these certain chromosomal structures and reproductive organ structures and psychological or brain understanding of self and body. So we say that to be masculine, it is to be a boy or a girl, right? To be male or female is to have a certain set of reproductive organs and then a gender that corresponds to those things. which we know isn't necessarily true. So what's fascinating to me as someone well over 50 is that for a long time, we've always known this, right? We have always, as human beings, known that people present their gender in a way that doesn't always fit in those neat little categories. There was Babe, the female golfer, right? Martina Navratilova, when I was growing up, who was my idol, and I still think she's cool. Billie Jean King, Chris Evert, right? And then people like Quentin Crisp, the actor, who describes himself as an elderly foreigner of dubious gender, right? So we have always throughout time, particularly in our sacred texts, and in the Near Eastern understanding, we have this concept of eunuchs. And that term referred to many types of presentations, not just people who had been castrated for purposes of service and or sometimes slavery, right? It also referred to people who were what we would think of as asexual, people who didn't identify as having sexual attraction to others, people who were celibate. It also referred to people that we might, in our day and time with the terms that we use, refer to as homosexual. So we know that from the dawn of time, people have presented in all manner of ways. And yet we, in this country in particular, are really, really uptight about what's a girl and what's a boy, what's male and what's female. For a long time, until probably the last 10 years, it was accepted practice when a male child was born to measure the penis at birth. And if it didn't, measure up to a certain number of centimeters, a decision was made to surgically alter that child and raise that child as female because it would have been too much and psychologically damaging for that male to grow up with a micropenis. Often these decisions were made without the consent of the parents. It happened, and then they brought them their little baby girl. So I'm saying this to you just to start you thinking about, and hopefully going down your own little rabbit trails of research about the history of gender in this country. And in others, but particularly in the United States, it's been pretty vile, actually, the way that we have manipulated bodies and hormones and people to suit our ideas of what is male and female. And yet we rebel as a culture when people of trans beingness decide to manipulate our own hormonal structure and our own bodies to fit more consistently with who we think we are. That upsets people. And yet we've done it to children at birth for a long, long time. So I want you to have those kind of frameworks in mind as you think about this idea that we're going to talk about later about what it means to be a self. So when we talk about transgender, then what we're really talking about is the self-understanding that one's self as gendered, as male or female or neither, or something somewhere in between, is inconsistent with the gender and often sex assignment that person received at birth, which is based upon a physical examination, and that's all. Chromosomal tests are sometimes done when there's suspicion that there's a need to do that, but typically that's not the case. So, common expressions that you might hear: trans, transgender, transmasculine, transfeminine, non-binary, gender fluid, gender neutral, gender queer. Any of these sound familiar? Yes, have you heard others? So you might also hear some people just say trans man or trans woman. And you might still hear some of us old-timers use the term transsexual. I prefer the term transsexual, and the reason for that is I continue to I just am fascinated by and daily more and more curious about this constant bisecting we do of gender and body, right? That we on one hand will say that they're not separate, and then we continue to just chop them up, right? So if we talk about the trans sense of being as only about gender, then what of these bodies, right? What of those of us who find things about our bodies just completely out of touch with who we are and unacceptable and then choose to alter them? Well, is that not about then my sex, right? If we understand sex as about reproductive organs, genitalia, then if I change my reproductive organs, that says something about what I need to do to be okay in my own skin. So it's not just about gender as much as there's this now politically correct, which by the way is usually decided by people not trans. Did you guys know that? The same way that if you ask most indigenous people in this country what they prefer to be called, they'll most decidedly not say Native American, right? And yet we're taught that's what's politically correct, but we didn't ask them. Most of them, not all, but most, and I'm Creek Indian too, by the way, most of us prefer indigenous or native, right? We don't think of ourselves as Americans. So trans folks aren't always talked about in the verbiage that we prefer because it's other people who decide for us what's politically correct, like trans experience, which, you know, y'all already know how I feel about that. So I think this aversion we have to the term transsexual tells us something about how uncomfortable we are in this culture just even using the word sex, or talking about what sex is or what it isn't, what bodily sex is, and then what constitutes a sex act and what does not. And we're constantly fascinated by how transgender folks actually have sex, or what their genital presentation is. If I had $1 for every time someone asked me an inappropriate question about which surgeries I've had, what my spouse and I do or don't do, I could take a really nice vacation. Unfortunately, they don't pay me when they make those comments, so I'm here with you tonight. So sex gender transition then refers to that process by which we discern that changes and alterations need to be made in our own skin and how we feel in our skin. And then we utilize some or all of a very long list and a wide range of medical means, legal means like name changes, birth certificate changes, gender marker changes, hormones, surgeries. Some people do none of those, and they're just as valid as those of us who do. Some people only change their name and their documentation, and some of us, like myself, change everything we can change. That's costly too, by the way. So sometimes we end up selling off everything we own or borrowing massive amounts of money. I could buy another house for what I paid for this. I often say that my chest surgery amounted to buying a used Cadillac. It's okay to laugh at this stuff. So an FTM, you might have heard that. How many of you have heard of FTM? How many of you know what it means? You think? Shout it out. Chris? Female to male. That means we're referring to a person who was assigned the gender and the sex corresponding to that of female at birth and does not sense himself as that. And then makes an adjustment or two or several to become and live fully as male. So MTF means then, what do you think? Male to female. You guys got all that? So you can go forth now and educate the world, right? So when we talk about sexuality, then what we're talking about is not something connected to our genitalia and to the part of our brains that understands ourselves as gendered. We're simply talking about patterns of experiencing and expressing sexual attractions and desires, fantasies, and sexual practices. And this may or may not include, for some people, feelings of romantic love. Other people are also asexual and do not sense a need to be sexually involved with others. What is important about all of this is that none of the things that we manifest in our sexual sense of self have anything to do with our genitalia, chromosomal structure, or our understanding of ourselves as gendered beings. If there were a connection between genitalia and chromosomes and sexual orientation, there would never have been gay people. And what's funny, to those of us in the LGBT community, is the LGBT community is the last one usually to get that. The assumption usually is that folks like me, and it just happens to be true in my case, that I was lesbian because I'm married to a woman now as a male, right? So, well, that's true-ish for the most part. But then there are a lot of FTMs who are what, when you look at them, you would think of as homosexual because they're still attracted to males. They were attracted to males before their transition. Sex and gender have nothing to do with sexuality. And interestingly, the occurrence of trans men in particular, who this is a phenomenon, it's a real thing. There are a large number of trans men who, while they were still female-bodied, dated women and were attracted to women and thought of themselves as lesbian. After transition and after some time on testosterone, they end up finding themselves attracted to men. Now, so then they are still yet homosexual again, right? They're still gay, right? But in the other direction. And this was a source of consternation to large numbers of our community. But it brought about some interesting research by which we began to develop an understanding that there's sort of some genetic markers for homosexual preference, right? Or for same gender preference, or same sex preference, which is utterly fascinating to me. But so you can, if you're destined to be gay, you're just destined to be gay, in other words, which also proves then there's no connection between those things. Does that make sense? Cisgender then is a term that we have developed. It comes from a Latin root meaning on the same or the near side of. And it was used to do away with, we hope, other confusing terms like biological males or biological females, which is just nonsensical if you stop and think about it. Just because I'm an FTM doesn't mean I stopped being a biological entity. I'm still a biological entity, and there's still biological stuff going on with me as a male person, right? So we're referring then to people whose sense of gendered self is fairly consistent with that which they were assigned at birth. Cisgender refers to people who identify as who the world sort of tells them they are in a gendered or sex way. Does that make sense? No? No.
Because, so both cisgendered and FTM? Yes, is that what you're saying?
Oh,
Because they're two different.
that's an interesting nuance. I get where you're going there. Did y'all catch that? That's really clever. So now I am aligned with the, yeah. So, but no, right? So, okay, cisgender, even though that's a really brilliant nuance. Cisgender, C-I-S-G-E-N-D-E-R. Cis means, it's a prefix of a Latin root, means on the near side or the same side of, right? It's used in chemistry and genetics, particularly in regard to DNA strands and chemical bonds. So if you align with the thing that you're on the same side of, you're cisgendered. In other words, if you think of yourself as male and you were assigned a male sex and a masculine gender at birth, then you're cisgendered. And that avoids that sticky wicket of what's a bio-male and what's not a bio-male, what's a bio-female and what's not a bio-female. And it also avoids the assumption that all biological males are the same or all biological females are the same.
So at some point, Liam, will you use those terms when we talk about HB2?
Well, actually, I'm in talks with some people about whether or not we might have a legalistic leg to stand on by attacking that language. Because the way the bill is written, it says biological gender. Well, I have a biological gender. It's male. So it's an erroneous use of language that I think can undercut what they're doing. And there's a bunch of us who are actually in talks about that. That's a good question. So This thing of trans beingness reminds us that being human is about being endowed with identity. That identity is not a fragmented thing. It is by our nature a beingness woven by internal and external thready things. Elements of sentient living, right? Connectedness, molecules and chemicals, experience, predispositions, silky skin stuff, seemingly intangible, yet no less formative things like love, acceptance, rejection, despair, kindness, boundless wonder and curiosity, unlikely kinships, small, simple joys. The self is a webby thing, conscious and unconscious, ever evolving, emerging in a cooperative, interconnected, interrelated creation that is both in our bodies and outside of our bodies. Trans beingness calls this into attention, right? Calls it into our very reality in our skins. And I hope it calls you to think about some of the same things. Being trans calls attention back to our bodies, our skin, our fleshy first homes, our spirited body substance as essential to us, rather than something temporary to be tolerated or escaped. It defies the tenets of substance dualism. Being trans makes us profoundly aware of and demands that we consider deeply that thing we commonly call the self. The body is always with us. We take it with us everywhere we go. You brought yours with you here. The body is that which allows us to be persons, to live and move and have our being in the world, in this world, the only world that we know. And yet we are taught that it is not our natural home, that we somehow exist apart from it and must escape it. Trans existence forces us to question the assumptions of bodiedness, of skin and flesh and spirit and self, and the constructed rules and codifications we've been given for how a self can be in the world. I like to think, and I could be wrong, and I'm willing to accept that I might be, it's actually quite likely that I am, but I do think that trans beings call our attention to really look more deeply at what is this thing we call the soul. Does it pre-exist our consciousness? Is it simply the result of consciousness in a body? Does the soul exist before and after us? And yet at the same time, it is in us, with us, always, around us, accessible to us, to others. It is us and yet beyond us. And it is that thing that allows trans persons to know we are something other than what the configuration of our bodies tells us we are, and the culture we live in tells us we are based on those bodies. How else then would we know? How else does a child at the normative developmental age that we form a sense of gender know this is not who I am? If there were not some self that both pre-exists and yet comes into being because of this skin. This is the stuff that keeps me awake at night thinking, right? This is the stuff I contemplate when I pray, right? And say thank you for making me a bodied soul. So, what I have to offer you is that trans people call us to really engage this idea of spirituality that I'm going to give you as a deeply embodied, vitally alive capacity for and disposition towards seeking meaning, connection, and encounter with mystery, with the sacred, with others, with creation, and that this resides within and characterizes our sentient nature. And that the one thing that trans people need from faith communities is grace in sufficient presence and proportion to engage one's own becoming. say that again. What we need most is grace and sufficient presence and proportion to engage our own becoming and to invite you to do the same in community and in company and in sacred presence with us. So questions, I think, that might be worth you considering as you talk are, what is this thing we call the self? What do your particular traditions teach you about that? What have you come to believe about what it means to be a self? What is this thing we call the soul? Is the persistent, just resilience of the self evidence of the soul? And then what things could you do to invite yourself into trans-beingness, right? Into transcending the understanding of who you're allowed to be that you've been given, and what might that mean for your spiritual life? And then third and finally, what can you do in your place to provide grace and sufficient presence and proportion for us to become? Thank you.